These are the voyages of the starship. I guess this is more the KDF vessel here. I don't know if any of you actually ever seen the shirt I got. It's the whole thing here. Anyways, all right, let's get on with this. So, one thing that occurred to me, and I was just talking about this. I just realized that my speaker's still on. You guys don't want to suddenly hear "pong," do you? There we go. One thing that's always occurred to me is, why do they do that next time thing, right? And it's always bugged me in a little bit of a way, and I never actually bothered to stop and think about why until this episode. And I'm sitting down, and it's like, not next time, excuse me, last time on Star Trek Next Generation. We get to hear Majel Barrett, or, whomever, actually say that. Why do they do that, right? I mean, obviously we know what the previous episode was, right? Then it hit me. This is another aspect of that mentality that Star Trek has always had, the aversion to string continuity and the idea that you have to be reminded that the previous episode is actually connected to the next one. And so they're appealing to that type of mentality and that audience by saying that, oh, hey, the last episode that you probably didn't see, here's the next episode. Now, yes, there are some reasons to have a discussion for why that's a good thing. But it always just kind of bugged me, and I think the reason why is it's so indicative of that perspective that obviously you didn't see the previous episodes, we have to remind you of what it was. Or, obviously you're too stupid to remember something that happened last week. I mean, come on. Now, I mean, sometimes a last time is acceptable. A season opener is a great example of that. But they do this constantly, and it just kind of bugs me. Anyways, that being said, it was a great episode, honestly. I have a note here. I'm just going to toss this out right now. Again, huge props to the directing. Great job. I don't really have anything else to add. Just watch the episode. You'll see what I mean. The cuts, the angles, the blocking. It's all top-notch stuff. One of the best scenes they had to time. I know I'm skipping ahead a bit, but this is directing comment. They wanted, when Robert Picardo came out, when the Doctor exits the limo, out in the open for the very first time. This is the first time ever, really, that he has basically been off the holodeck or off of sickbay, and so he's there, and he's actually out in the open and out in the world, and he's got that look of wonder on his face. And they picked a good time of day for it. It was a sunny day. The sun was at just the right angle, so you get that extra tiny little flavor of impression that he's literally stepping out into the sunlight. And it's really hard to get that kind of a shot together. And they timed it so that they would record those scenes at the proper time of day, so they would have that daylight effect. It was really well done. So again, huge props to the directing. Let's talk about the Montana subplot. I know, you're probably thinking, what's the Montana subplot? They go to Arizona. Yeah, think about that for a moment. It had to be moved to Arizona in order to make it be kind of shifted into the plot as opposed to what it was originally be. Originally there was this whole other plot, a C plot basically, or I guess a D plot actually, about these Montana radicals who were paramilitaries basically, and we're going to go do this whole paranoid anti-government thing. Then we're going to have to rescue them from them, and it's going to be a commentary on how mental illnesses can affect human beings, even if they have no control over themselves. Pity the poor helpless humans of the 20th century. Blah 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 blah. Right? Whether that's a good thing or not is debatable. Actually, I think it would have made an interesting episode or arc in its own right, to be totally honest. But the problem is, well, that was in the original 3 or 4-parter episode thing that they were going to do. And when they chopped it down to 2, they had to chop that down to the point where it was basically just a little bit of a segue. Here's the catch. You might be wondering, why leave it in at all at that point? Because it's actually, I've known several people who watch this 2-parter, and I remind them that the Montana thing the Arizona thing happens, and they have to think about it like, oh yeah, because it's so irrelevant to everything that they don't really remember it. Why leave it in at all? It doesn't add anything. The answer is the ironic, humorous little situation. I feel actually bad for the editing and the producers here. They chopped it down, so they had to chop that storyline down, but they couldn't actually get rid of it because then they had too little footage just the A and B plots and the storyline and the scripts for those were not enough to pad out to 2 episodes, so they had to throw in what is basically literally padding in order to flesh it out. That being said, we did get a couple of good shots, mostly with the Doctor. The effect they had for the gunshots hitting the wall behind him, they had a fake wall and they had these little explosive pellets set on them. It was really good effects, all things considered. Very, very creative way of doing things, and so it looked like they were shooting right through them. And then, the gentleman says, oh, Mother, God in heaven, or whatever he says, and he says, divine intervention is unlucky. That was a good scene. So, again, props to the directing and props for actually doing something with the problem, but kind of wish that had just been chopped. One other thing I want to mention here, though, Foundation Imaging, I've mentioned them before. They had a chance to show off again. They're the guys who did Bab 5. They really started doing stuff in the Swarm. And in this episode, they got to do a fair number of pretty tricky effects with the satellite, with the shuttle hovering over Arizona, the explosion of the truck. A lot of, again, as I just inferred, a lot of actual, real special effects as opposed to CGI ones. So some good stuff there. Finally, we're going to talk about this here. I kept mentioning it last time, and I kept swearing to myself I was going to mention it this time. So let's just talk about this for real. Now, I've bashed Brannon Braga just like everyone in the known universe has. The poor man gets so much flack. But one thing I will always do is also praise him. I've talked about this extensively before, and I don't really feel like retreading that ground, but suffice it to say that I honestly feel bad for Brannon Braga, and I don't actually think he is a hack or a bad writer. I think that he had the complications that I've already mentioned. I don't want to reiterate that ground. But I like to really give the man credit when he has a genuinely good idea and really implements it well, because the mobile emitter was pretty much all Brannon Braga, and he pushed for it too. There was resistance to him pushing out the mobile emitter from the executive board, from Berman, of course there was, and from Robert Picardo himself, who was just like, I don't know if that's going to be a good thing. I don't know if that's going to ruin my character. But honestly, I think the mobile emitter was a great idea, really helped him take him into a new direction. See, here's the thing, character-wise, the Doctor had basically come to as much of a full circle of his initial character arc as he could. There really wasn't much else room to move without moving on to the next step, the next iteration in his life, in his arc, and actually basically begin a new arc, right? The mobile emitter is arguably the second best way to do that. The first best being what happened in the Swarm. Which brings me to my next point, really quick. I'm just going to toss this in here. I cannot believe this, but like I mentioned back in the Swarm, the events of him, losing all his memory, or well, most of his memory, and having the severe malfunction he was going through, actually does have an effect here, because it kind of helped to lead into this situation. Now, granted, it's a minute thing, and mostly it's us just inferring, but at least they acknowledged the fact that he had that happen in the Swarm, so that here he could mention it and explain why he isn't quite the way he was before. So good step on that, in all honesty. But yeah, so the mobile emitter, it lets him move. It's such a brilliant idea, and he fitted into the storyline marvelously. There's this time ship from the billionth 29th century, and they come in, and the villain actually hooks it up to him, and he does it, and it's so in character for Sterling. He just does it as a convenience. He's just like, here, so I can keep an eye on you, basically. And it's so in character because it's kind of a really dumb thing to do if you think about it, but well, we'll talk about Sterling more later, but I'm sorry, I don't really have much else to add, but if you really break down the series as a whole, the Doctor's character arcs, with a few missteps, really are the highlight of this series. The Doctor and Seven, mainly because the two actually had character arcs, whereas most of the other cast did not. But the mobile emitter was a great idea, and I'm just going to move on. So, let's talk about Tom, Paris, and Rain. I forget her last name. One of the things I was surprised by rewatching this is I actually really liked the scenes with the two of them together, even when the others were present. And I think what boils down to not only a degree of chemistry between the two actors who are doing a really good job of portraying, and playing off of each other. One of the lines that really strikes me is she mentions how Tom is so weird because he, thinks about more than his small, simple life, and he really cares about something larger than himself. And he looks at her and just says, that's so unusual? And she says, very matter-of-factly, but she delivers this line perfectly. Yeah, that is really unusual, I liked that, and it really showed the dynamic between the two and why she would be so engaged with him. I also like the fact that there was a genuine innocence to the romance between the two. And I know that sounds weird, but there's a difference between a womanizer and a ladies' man. A womanizer treats women as if they're objects or dogs or trophies or otherwise not people. In other words, they are something to be acquired. A ladies' man is someone who is very fluent in being around women, usually in a romantic nature. And the idea was always for Tom Paris to be a ladies' man, not a womanizer. And this, I'm kind of parroting the actor here too, because he felt the same way as I do. But I do generally agree with him. The idea here that this was a good way to show him as being good with women by having this nice innocent touch to what is basically at best, just kind of an interest. The two just having that sort of flirtatious, datey kind of a situation between them that's only one step past what you would call friendship. I think it really added to the dynamic between the two. I mentioned that already. So let's go ahead and talk about Sterling. I mentioned we would. Sterling is interesting. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and say this first. I still like the actor. I still like his performance, and it's for the same reasons as last time. He's obviously enjoying himself. He's obviously throwing himself into it. And yet, you can see in a couple of times his face kind of blanks out a bit, and you can tell it's because he doesn't know what emotion he should be portraying for that given scene. And it only happens a couple of times. And it's basically when Sterling is being completely retardedly stupid. But he nevertheless really tries to throw his emotion and his enthusiasm into the role, and it really comes across beautifully. That being said, Sterling is even more stupid and preparedly intelligent this time around. It's such a weird thing. He does so many things that are so stupid, and yet it kind of fits with the character we've seen in the previous episode. And then he has an anti-teleportation device on his person at all times. Think about that for a moment. Think about the kind of preparation and the caution and the thought that goes into preparing such a device to function in such a way for it to prevent a technology you didn't know existed and have never actually seen in action and cannot see in action, to prevent that kind of technology from working against you and just to keep that on you just in case they ever come after you. That's simultaneously impressive and kind of horrifying when you think about the kind of mind that would do that sort of thing. And then, of course, he does things like, well, I need to go to the future because mankind needs it. And yet, even after being told that the future is going to be destroyed, his response is basically, so? Ignoring the fact that he would be destroyed too, and that he's not supposed to be a multi-billions killing mass murderer kind of character, he just kind of brushes it off. Now, that being said, we do kind of get the implication that he doesn't actually believe any of that is true. But it's just kind of weird that he is just so blasé in the face of all his particular forms of villainy. And of course, I mentioned the Doctor thing earlier. I mentioned this here, and I want to mention this again just really quick. The Doctor, Rob Picardo, does a lot of really subtle things. Tiny little things when he got in the open for those first few scenes in the sun. Squinting, he deliberately looks in. If you notice, he could look in any direction. If you notice, the gentleman playing Sterling does this, but Ricardo specifically looks into the sun so that he can squint, because that's not something the Doctor's ever had to deal with before. And he does little things, sniffing the air, or the way he runs. This is beautiful. Watch the scene where he runs again. And I know what you're thinking. It's just some guy in a PJ suit running. But really think about it for a moment. The Doctor's never run before in his entire life. He understands it mechanically speaking. And Picardo, I bet I could literally picture this. There's no information on this, unfortunately. But I could picture him actually practicing, like in front of a large mirror or something, to try and look as that very specific blend of awkward and yet functional at the same time, so that his run was like, ugh, and you could tell he's never done this kind of thing before. Really, really amazing performance by Picardo. Huge props. Speaking of Sterling, I'm sorry, let's segue back into Sterling here for a moment. Okay, I'm just going to say this. I hate it when just about anything gets preachy. Book, movie, game, doesn't matter. And I really have gotten tired of the preachiness of Star Trek over the last, 30 years, 40 years, whatever long it's been at this point that I've been watching Star Trek. It's gotten old. Okay, I'm tired of it. I'm tired of you constantly telling me about how wonderful the future is. Now, that being said, Most of that comes from the early TNG era, when I was, pretty much first beginning my real getting into Star Trek. Between that and the movies, that was my, oh, this is Star Trek. Oh, I love this. So I really started getting into it then. So I was really exposed to that a lot. And if you've watched season 1 and season 2 of TNG, you know that they just like to preach all over the place. That went down quite a bit later on in TNG and DS9, and Voyager likes to bring it back. I've kind of described why. It's that whole dogma thing with regards to Star Trek as an intellectual property. But the idea here is every time I see it, it's not actually like it happens that often. It's just, I see it and I'm reminded of it. And it's like, my tolerance level has been pushed down by having seen it so much in the early TNG era that when I see it again, it's just, oh god, I can't take it anymore. So seeing Catherine Janeway preaching at Sterling actually genuinely made me just go, ugh. Just like this, as I'm watching, because I was watching it here, I was just like, oh my god. Really? Let me mention one other weird thing here. I mentioned last time that henchman and how I wanted to know more about why he was so damn loyal. This man has had his boss was gone and screwed, and he could have just left him there, but he goes through all this effort to get a beam him back from the satellite, which, by the way, again goes back to that crazy preparedness I mentioned earlier. What is this guy, Batman, except stupid? Anyway, so he beams him back and gets them all back, and he goes back, and what does Sterling say? And I quote, "Good work." And then he goes into his next orders. That's it. He got an attaboy for saving his boss from the worst possible situation. That's it. Why is this man so loyal? And then he goes off and tries to murder people, and then fails, and then gets killed. Why is he so loyal? I want to know. Another little tiny tidbit. For those of you who like to pay attention, I've often thought about doing a counter for this sort of thing throughout Star Trek. Beaming through the shields is one of those things that has been a plot point fairly often. The fact that you can't. And fundamentally, if you're just looking at the technology as it's presented to us, consistently and continuity-wise, yeah, you shouldn't be able to beam through the shields, not unless you have the exact frequency of that shield that is up right now. In other words, the idea being that the frequency changes every time the shields are raised, which makes sense. Or you have some ridiculously advanced technology like the Borg to just beam right through. Also makes sense. And I mention this because Star Trek likes to just kind of seesaw on that. Sometimes you can just beam through the shields without effort, and then sometimes you can't, and then sometimes it's a plot point again, and then sometimes it's not a plot point. It does that so much, it gets kind of bothersome. But I only mention it here because this is exactly why maintaining consistency on that would be a good thing, because the idea that they managed to beam through the Voyager shields to get them back with this super teleporter that they had from the 29th century would have been, like, it would have had more impact. It would have actually meant something if not being able to go through the shields was regularly presented as it should be. And I just felt like mentioning that here. One of the things I would have loved to see come out of this duology is the idea of Harry Kim starting on his officer track in a similar vein to the way Deanna did, even though that was basically a very minor thing and had very small implications on the thing. Imagine if Harry had started actually, getting on the officer track, starting working for promotion, started taking command more often, and that actually became his next character arc. I think that would have been really cool, personally, especially since Harry hasn't actually had a character arc yet. He is arguably the most lamentable, regrettable character in the series so far. We'll be talking about this more when we get further into this season. I'm just curious if any of you agree with me on that, because I think that would have been kind of cool. I also want to mention something about Rain. One of the things that was tossed around a lot in the production area when they were hammering the script out is whether or not Rain would come onto the Voyager or not. Now, the actress herself was adamant that she not actually become a regular or a regular guest star, as in a similar vein to several other characters have done in the past. Barclay being a great example there. And it was because she was afraid of the kind of commitment of dedicating to that kind of work. And I understand that, actually. There's a reason Avery Brooks hasn't done anything since Deep Space Nine. He was killing himself doing that show regularly. Great actor, amazing actor, supremely talented. But there is a surprise. I mean, most people underestimate just how much of it will take out of you to do a regular show every week, day in, day out, as your main job. I swear I wasn't talking about myself there. I was just talking about television. But you get the, I do mean this, that you get the idea. And so I sympathize with that, but they wanted to kind of bring her on and maybe do something with her on Voyager, and I feel like there's some missed potential with that, because it would have been interesting to see, and I know this sounds horribly, almost morbid, but the idea, I mean, picture the situation. Here's someone, and you meet someone from the future who also is a space traveler, and it's like, yeah, I get to go back with you, and oh, by the way, we're trapped on the other side of the galaxy. I mean, think about that. You're the one time you encounter a time traveler from 3.5 centuries in the future, and they're stuck over there in the Deadlands. Poor woman. One final note before I go into my last 2 points here. Sterling has his last lines are, "Oh." I can't say it like he does. He does it in a very particular fashion. Apparently, they did several takes of just that line because he wanted to get across the perfect blend of realization and the idea that he himself was never someone who was basically supposed to be taken seriously, because the actor always felt like his villain was always kind of a cartoony, silly villain kind of a character. So it comes across as just half Looney Tunes and half, oh god, I'm about to die. And it's a weird blend, but he does it perfectly. It's always stuck in my head there. So, last couple of notes here before I move off. One of the things that I'm sorry. It was, I mentioned earlier that the preachiness thing gets to me, right? I have a similar problem with the Prime Directive, but this was a much later problem. The Prime Directive was only really brought up a few times in TNG, really. If you think about it, I think it's a grand total of like 5 times. I don't really remember it being brought up all that often in Deep Space Nine, maybe a couple of times. Voyager brings it up all the goddamn time. Voyager is when the Prime Directive started pissing me off. Until this point, it had bothered me a few times, and I disagreed with it. But it was just a law, and I disagree with most laws, so, that makes perfect sense. The fact that you can't go whaling in Oklahoma or whatever it is, that's a law that I disagree with, because it's stupid. But the point being, Voyager is when the Prime Directive started being dogmatic. And that's, I think, pretty much the reason I disliked it so much in its presentation here. It kind of got worse in Enterprise in its own way, and I don't want to talk about that too much, but it is, I hate myself for saying this, but it was almost satisfying seeing the Voyager crew get burned by the Prime Directive. The temporal Prime Directive in this case. The fact that, nope, sorry, we're going to send you right back to Doomsville, because screw you, we're not supposed to interfere because you can't know the consequences of interfering. Which is actually kind of a fallacy if you think about it. I mean, yes, you cannot know the consequences of interfering, but you also cannot know the consequences of not interfering or doing anything or doing nothing. That's literally like saying, the water is occasionally wet. I'm sorry, I'm getting preachy. It was just nice to see them burn on that, but then, and this is my second point, as soon as I started thinking about it, I was like, yeah, screw you, which is almost literally what went through my head. I started thinking about it. How different would the future have been if they had brought them back to Earth? This is when the Dominion War was still happening. Think about that for a second. Think about all the things that they would have learned and grown up to this point. Would Voyager actually been able to contribute to the Dominion War? Would they have been able to continue the storyline back in the Alpha Quadrant in a post-war society? There's a lot of potential there, but the other thing I find interesting from a thought exercise perspective is think about all they would be missing out on. Seven would obviously never have joined the cast. The Borg would have never become the Force, and then later the Joke, that they were in Voyager. They never would have encountered the Herosians, or the lizard people, who I can't think of their names right now. I don't know, the idiots, as I like to call them. They're also in Star Trek Online, in case you're curious. What are those guys called? Whatever. A lot of things would not have actually happened, and by the time they got back, at the end of the way the timeline actually went, Voyager brought back a lot of stuff, a lot of information, a lot of technology, and a huge swath of capacity that Starfleet just ate up. One of the things Star Trek Online really did with its storyline was continue with that thought process that the reason Starfleet has advanced so much and so quickly is because Voyager came back with a database completely full of goodies, basically. So I wonder how things would have gone differently if they'd come back now instead of, 4 years from now. Now, you guys know that I like to do my little my version, page 1 rewrite. of Voyager, and I was thinking about Future's End as an overall work. I've already kind of mentioned the big thing I would change, which is about Captain Braxton. Either make him demented or make him cynical. I like the demented idea. I like the fact that he literally lost his mind at the thought of dozens of billions of people dying, because that's probably exactly what would have happened. Think about that. You wouldn't even have to have family or friends or have lived in the Sol system to look at the death of tens of billions and say, wow, that's kind of screwed up. So yeah, I would have gone with that tact on things. I also would have handled the reset button a little bit differently. By which I mean, how do I put this? I I like the idea that, I believe it or not, I like the way the reset button was done in this episode. In other words, someone from another timeline comes in and pushes them back to their own time to reset things. But the one thing they never do is they never mention if time has been reverted or not. I like the idea that they did actually influence the past. Sterling actually influenced the past. All that stuff actually happened. But then they destroy Sterling, which breaks the loop. But because of the massive amount of insert thing here, and this has been seen in Star Trek many times, in other words, because they are already so affected by the tachyon and chronoton particles that are swarming them, the changes to the timeline do not affect them. Year of Hell is another good example, actually, of the idea of a ship being completely unaffected by changes in the timeline around it. And so then, Voyager's there with the time having been completely altered around them, but then the time ship comes back. And even that has holes in it, because you can't really hit the reset button and have everyone remember it without screwing everything up. And they needed people to remember it because they needed that mobile emitter. You see the problem. I would have to go back and actually really rewrite how this whole time thing worked to actually make it make sense, which I'm not going to do right now. And ultimately that's just to make sure it actually has no plot holes, which I like doing, but that's a low priority on the scale when it comes down to writing. Which probably explains a lot of Voyager. And Enterprise. Other thing I would have done, though, I know the actress had no interest in coming back, which is a shame, because I would have loved to do something with Rain in the future. One of the things I would have done is I would have changed Sterling. I would have made Sterling one of two things. I made a note there, and I'm going to just kind of think about my thoughts here. In one direction, well, hang on. Which one do I want to talk about first? That's right. In the one direction, you could say that he was actually obsessive. Genuinely obsessive. For those of you who don't know what that means, I don't know if you guys are anything like any of the people in my life, but the words OCD tend to be tossed around without meaning them literally. You just go, oh, you're just being OCD because you like your desk to be in one order or whatnot. But that's not actually OCD, and that's not actually obsessive. Make him literally, chemically, mentally obsessive. Someone who has to keep inventing, has to keep understanding new technology. And make the character arc be as much about his need to examine and explore and discover new technology and his obsession with it, as much as it is to then disseminate that to the world. And maybe have an underlying current of the fact that he actually, he basically is not actually that interested in the betterment of the world or whatnot. He just uses that as an excuse so that he can, A, continue funding his efforts and research, and B, make himself feel better about things at the end of the day. By the way, I would have made the henchman a portable hologram. It makes a lot of sense if you think about it, especially since he already had the technology. Anyways, second take on Sterling. The idea of making him deluded, fully delusional. In other words, and they kind of hint at this in the episode, but they never really take it the full step. Make him genuinely paranoid. Make him genuinely bipolar, and actually portraying that rather than just the Captain Planet villain, as I mentioned before. Now, granted, acting bipolar is actually a lot harder to do than it sounds, but it would have been interesting to have this this genius man bouncing around emotionally constantly and having raving paranoid delusion threats, having him actually break down while he's on the ship of Voyager, while he's in the brig. By brig, I mean sick bay, of course, for some reason. And he's just literally smashing the place up and cannot contain himself because he is just so lost at the thought that he was right about everything, and all his preparation and all his years of work has now been taken away. And then he gets pulled back and he has to, and he just reverts instantly to his other side of things, It would have been interesting to see him as someone who genuinely does not believe Janeway and genuinely thinks he has to do this because this is the way things should be. I should be the one to push technology to the world, and it's not like about destiny or fate or even the power or control it gives him. It's because in his mind this is the way things should be. I just think that would have been an interesting take on him instead of the Captain Planet villain. That's all I got to talk about. Hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you on the next one.
Chakotay to Janeway. Captain, we have no other choice.
He's entering the rift.
Fire!
Uh-oh.